Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning if you are in other places, not in Europe, or probably good night. Welcome to the first activity of the Chair for the Metaverse, Chair for the Responsible Development of the Metaverse. My name is Aurelio López Tarruella. I'm Assistant Professor of Private International Law at the University of Alicante, and I'm the Director of the Chair. The chair was created in the beginning of this year with the purpose of promoting the research on the legal and ethical aspects of the metaverse. And we are planning to organize several activities, webinars like this one during this year and the following year. If you would like to have further information, please visit our website or follow us in LinkedIn. In any case, I will announce the following activities by the end of this roundtable. I would like to thank the speakers for your availability to work with us, and I pass the word to my colleague and member of the scientific committee, Gaetano Dimita. Please, Gaetano, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for letting us open this series of activities. It's very exciting to be here. I know we're talking about the metaverse, but I'm always sorry when I don't get the chance to meet friends in person. And some things are never going to change. I think even in the future, we'll still appreciate meeting in person. And thank you very much for inviting me to host and chair this first webinar, because I got an incredible opportunity to invite, to speak friends with which we have been talking about this issue probably even before the metaverse became a thing. And we were probably targeting, I mean, our main area of expertise was video games. And some of the discussion we had were about the launch of Second Life. So it's been 20 years to some extent of discussion of what now are becoming issue and questions that are not only relevant to people that are passionate about video games, but there are issue and questions that we all have to deal with. And today we have this amazing opportunity because it's almost impossible. I don't know if it never happened. Kim, Micaela, and Jon were in the same place at the same time discussing this issue. You normally, best scenario, you get 2 out of 3, but 3 out of 3, this is the first time ever. They're going to share with us their vision, their understanding, and their question, what they're actually, I'm not saying that they're keeping them awake at night, but think that they deeply care and they've been deeply involved for several years and constantly impact their day work life, because they're people that are deeply involved and have been deeply involved in the discussion. So we are gonna structure this session in a semi-formal way, but it's gonna be totally informal. I invited them to give us their first pitch, short pitch on the characteristic, the aspect, and the question they are more keen to discuss today. And then we will open for a full discussion between the 3 speakers and hopefully with the audience later on. And I'm gonna let them introduce themselves because I want them to actually just mention the main reason they're so passionate and so close to this topic instead of reading their CVs. But look them up online because they are amazing people with extensively long and valuable CVs. So Kimberly, I'm gonna give you the floors if you can enlighten us, because this is always the case when you speak at a conference or a seminar.
Awesome. Thank you so much. You are effusive in your praise as always. You make me blush, but thank you for the wonderful introduction. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right. Well, thank you again for having me here. This is, as you mentioned already, a topic I'm very passionate about. I've thought a lot about this even before the metaverse was the thing to think about, and I'm very excited to have a chance to share some thoughts. So just jumping in really quickly. So my name is Kimberly VOLL. By day, I run a small game development studio here in Vancouver, Canada. By night and every other moment I can squeeze it in, I also co-founded and help run the Fair Play Alliance, which is a global cross-industry initiative of today over 300 gaming companies and related organizations, all of us working together to change how games are made. We focus on reducing hate and harassment to help players thrive, apply development practices, things like wellness by design, and in particular working with companies to help understand, operationalize, and prioritize this work. Me personally, I have a PhD in computer science specializing in AI and an honors degree in cognitive science. And I am very interested and very focused at the intersection of humans and technology, in particular digital spaces and digital social dynamics. You know, when I was little, back in the early 80s, I just wanted to know if my computer could talk to me. You know, I spent the first half of my career in academia looking at problems around AI and doing game development on the side. And about 10 or so years ago, I inverted that and went full-time into the games industry, and I still do a lot of academic related things on the side. I spent several years at Riot Games, where I was a principal game designer. There I developed the player dynamics design discipline, which really focuses on how, as game designers, we can help players play well together. Between that and my work with the FPA, I've had the chance to work on games and multiplayer games of all scales, some massive, which has really helped inform a lot of my thinking in this space. So yeah, excited to share some thoughts on that. So I thought I'd just start by first talking a little bit about what I think the metaverse is, which I know is not an easy question to answer, but I like to think of sort of if there's a destination or end state, it's this idea of a large scale, persistent, interoperable, synchronous digital space with presence, which that word salad unpacked really just means shared spaces on the order of millions or more of concurrent users. It doesn't disappear when everyone logs off. It's still there. It's persistent. It is interoperable in the sense that it is cross-functional, it is decentralized or distributed, federated. It's an ecosystem that can be public, semi-public, or even fully privatized and intermixed. The events in this space transpire in real time. We can't hit pause or restart, and there's a way to be there. So compare that to, say, reading something on the internet, which is basically no presence, versus a fully consuming experience where the mediation layer disappears. If you think about playing a game through a controller or using a mouse and keyboard to interface with your computer, that is that mediation layer. But when we are talking about virtual worlds, the metaverse is representing this goal state at the end of this growing immersiveness of these experiences. So, okay, this was supposed to be a thing, and some recent headlines that have popped up. Is the dream dead? What happened to the metaverse? I mean, the reality is the metaverse predated the hype. It will, and it is outliving it. I think we're seeing the hype die. You know, 2022 was the year of the metaverse. 2023 is the year of ChatGPT and generative AI. And I don't know what 2024 will be, but I do not think it is dead. I think there's really two ways to think about it. Whoops, let me go back. Overzealous clicking. One is just the steady progression of virtual worlds. You know, the fact that there are plenty of virtual worlds happily going about things exactly as they were before all of the hype, and not just in gaming. Obviously, I am very gaming centric, so I'm very focused on those. But it's useful to think about the fact that there was a time when software was just that. It was aware, it was a good, it was something that we used. Whereas today, it's really an extension of reality. You know, software today is a place we occupy. It's a place we live out our lives, where we realize our social needs and other needs. We connect with others, etc. It is encompassing our lives in a very real way. That hasn't changed. That hasn't gone away. That progression is still there. And so the other way to think about this is from the lens of the tech. You know, if we define the metaverse as this one goal state that we need to get to and conceive of it, you know, however various companies may want us to conceive of it, we may or may not get there, right? It's trying to predict the future, but it's really an oversimplification. I think it's much better to think in terms of the metaversal tech. So which are really kind of three key pillars. There's the richness of interactivity. There are the economic ways in which we are connecting and finding new ways to consume and market things and all that comes with that. And then there's just the vastness of the scale. These are not small little environments where you hang out with a couple of friends, but we are talking about enormous, as I said earlier, on the order of millions kind of scales. So the tech is marching on. I don't see the metaverse's obituary as a sign that we should move on. It's actually, if anything, maybe some precious time to slow down and think, which is a big part of why we're here today to talk about this stuff. So what do we need to think about then? I'm gonna breeze through these. You know, hopefully we'll dig into more of these as we go, and I could spend ad nauseum on these topics, but I will give you just the teaser top of each of these. The first is just the intensity of harms. When we're talking about the level of fidelity and immersiveness that we are, as that grows, so does the visceralness of what you're experiencing in these spaces. So does the deepening of social inequity. You know, we talk a lot about online spaces as being equal, but equal for whom is really the question. There is not necessarily ease of access, either through access to the technology or through the social inequalities that are manifest in these spaces that create, barriers. And then there's also just general implications of federated systems that we need to be thinking through and what that intermixing means at such a grand scale. There's also the content proliferation. We are being blasted by information. We are drawn to it like moths. It feeds us, right? Our brains want this. They're hungry for it. And we have developed ways that are very good to serve up juicy information. And so we are seeing a proliferation of things like misinformation and disinformation. We are seeing economies of hate form up around us. We are seeing the platforming of bad actors and the attempt somewhat to deplatform them, but we're not doing a very good job of that. And I would say encapsulating all of this is just a general lack of maturity as a society to navigate this so-called post-truth world. We are also seeing a very significant blurring of lines between corporate and public interest. And, you know, the ease with which we are able to give up or willing to give up our information in the right conditions. It's not always bad to give up our information, but it's happening at an unprecedented scale. And I would say with a deep lack of awareness of what this actually means, partly because that awareness is not propagated through the larger community, and partly because I don't think we know yet, and we haven't been asking those questions and holding ourselves accountable to those answers as the rush of technology has sort of pulled us along. And there's exceptions, including all of my wonderful colleagues in this space, but I think that it is a very real concern. There's also things like fewer barriers to your data. And if you're not familiar with Britton Heller's work, she coined the term biometric psychography, which is just this notion that the richness and fidelity of our behavior within these technological spaces means we're much better able to track and derive information, you know, and this goes well beyond traditional notions of PII or personally identifying information. And we're seeing a heavy commoditization of things. You know, generative AI is making the commoditization of knowledge much more complete, right? There's a whole class of AI consumers and resellers now that we didn't see up until very recently. And in creating everything, as in the whole world, all of these digital spaces, we create with it the opportunity to commoditize it all. And the advancement of AI means we can take far more than is obvious, like how I move through a digital space, everything but the thoughts I think, and even those can be inferred. So this is very pervasive. This is very insidious form of consumerism or surveillance capitalism that we need to be acutely aware of. And you know, we're going to talk a lot about what's great about the metaverse too, but just to give you a juicy dystopian thought, as consumers, we are being consumed and being fed back to ourselves for purchase. And that's something I think we need to be aware of and understand the implications of that. And this doesn't happen overnight. It happens slowly because we think we want it. So how do we bring this kind of all back to what we are facing? I think the crux of the issue here centers on an artificial separation of what is online and what is offline, what is real life and what is not real life, what is IRL, and so forth. But this is really actually an amalgamation, and we need to rethink this. We need to rewrite the narrative to incorporate that so that these things don't happen in this way. You know, society is people working together for mutual benefit and a social contract and this appropriate societal infrastructure to support social services and rules and laws and protocols and enforcement of all of these things. Online spaces don't have that unless we put it there. We need to bring it in with intentionality, and they don't have a lot of the constraints or hard-earned societal evolutions that we have developed. And believe me, there's still plenty of problems in society, but those are absent fully in these digital environments unless we put them there. So we need to be able to step up and take a greater control and bring greater intentionality to how we are designing and developing these spaces. And just as a last really quick thought before I'll hand off to my colleagues. Okay, so that sounds great. Let's think about it that way. Let's do that. Well, who is responsible for this is the big question. You know, it's all IRL, as I say. It's all real life. This is an extension of society's journey on tech. And right now, there's a lot of finger pointing going on. This company's doing this. This company's not doing enough. There's not enough regulation. There's not enough this. Yes, there's a lot of problems all over the place. But I believe that while things like regulation and laws and whatnot have a critical place, an absolutely critical place, it's one piece of a larger puzzle. We really need to be thinking about the metaverse and digital social spaces as social infrastructure. So design with that intentionality, design with a duty of care, but also we need to be putting public interests and public health first. We need to teach our children not just how to use the tech, but how to treat others with respect. We need to humanize the people on the other side of our screens or whatever mediating interface we are using. In short, we need to humanize the technology, not digitize humans. And so I'll leave it on that. I'm looking forward to digging into the conversation, but first I'm also excited to hear from Micaela and Jon. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. I was taking notes. No, I'll get back to a few points because that was a brilliant introduction. And I love the fact that you also underlined that our discussion here and our discussion in the project goes beyond the hype for the metaverse, because we might not be calling the metaverse anymore in a year or two, but the problematics we're discussing, they've been with us for a number of years and they will be with us for more years to come. Mika, you're next.
Let me unmute myself. I was taking note as well. It's always a pleasure to have this conversation. And I'm going to say publicly, I want to work with you, Kim. We are super aligned. So a lot of the things I'm saying might resonate in one way or another with that. And also it's a pleasure to be here with Jon as well. I think you chose a very, very aligned panel in terms of our ideas. Let me share my screen and talk a bit about, tell me if you are seeing it correctly. Perfect. Well, who am I? I am Micaela MANTEGNA. I'm an affiliate at Bergman Klein Center for Internet and Society, where I lead the video game and XR policy working group. We are working on a report of the metaverse, and we try to do it like trying to cover in a more panoramic way and without the hype what is happening with the metaverse. I'm also a TED Fellow, and I had the chance to talk about these issues in that stage and kind of raise that concerns. And I am a member of the World Economic Forum Future for the Metaverse Council that we are just started this new session on the past month. For the next 2 years, I hope to be helping to shape the future of the metaverse. And also, I have to say I'm a Trekkie. So a lot of my thought comes from Star Trek. My philosophical thoughts come from Star Trek, and a lot of the reference you're going to find. By profession, I'm a lawyer, but I have spent the last 7 years thinking about ethics and artificial intelligence with a fellowship with Google back in the day in 2017. So. And also a master in IP law that I did my master's thesis on creativity, generative AI, way back before it was cool. So Fortunately, I'm seeing a lot of the bad prophecies coming to life, so that is where I'm coming from. So jumping right into the ethical questions for the metaverse, and I wanted to have this as a framework to think along when we are talking on this short presentation and on the conversation. And I think it also relates to a lot of ways we use technology, but for me, we need to understand why are we building it? Because we already have a decentralized internet, and we know the good and bad things that it brought to our lives. So for me, what the metaverse could bring to the table, how it's different from the technologies that we already have. So let's find a meaning on the metaverse, and why are we building purpose and meaning. And also we have the bad experience. Part of my background is on internet governance. So a lot of my past 10 years have been working around the balance of how internet is shaped and who can seize control of different stages. We know that we have today a dynamic of power and economy, which is a concentration. So how can we avoid going into the metaverse, repeating the same structures and balances? And there is a very important part of the conversation that is how this is going to impact in our tangible world. Let's not say real world, because I agree with Kim that everything is real, and what happens in digital worlds is real as well. So let's use the word tangible. But these structures, both AI and these systems, are consuming a lot of resources, not just computing power, but also if you're going to think about a metaverse based on blockchain, it takes a lot of electricity in the current framework to make it work. So how this is going to create this infrastructure without deteriorating the climate crisis that we are having. And this is also an issue of climate justice, because the lesser advanced countries are paying the cost of what might be the economical booms for the first world countries. And finally, but not the last important, is how this is going to impact our society and human rights. And this is talking about equity and inclusion, how we access to the metaverse, what are the choking points, do we access, as Kim was saying, in equal conditions? This is something that we always talk about, but there is difference about gender and how the devices are created in different ways that are making more nauseous female users because of the interpopular distance. So if we are thinking about the future of work in the metaverse, how does this kind of increase the gap that we already have? So I can swear that we didn't talk with Kim before this, but for me it was like, the metaverse is dead, long live the metaverse, and we have seen the same editorial putting like the gravestone into the metaverse. And for me, the interesting thing is like, fantastic, because we saw this huge spike of interest in the metaverse, and the people that was there before was like, brace yourself because the corporate market is coming. And we see every company, every major corporate conglomerate trying to get into the metaverse and doing something that has to be metaversely. We see high fashion brands, we see every time of consumer brands trying to get this kind of fear of missing out into the metaverse. And at some point, metaverse became this kind of a catch-all term to talk about things that were transmedia. So a transmedia strategy from NFTs was a metaverse strategy, and the terms tend to get a little more diffuse. Of course, there was a lot of money on the line, and everyone was trying not to miss that. So for me, the question is, if we are saying that the metaverse is dead, is it? And which one are we talking about? Because we are not talking about public metaverses and the different initiatives that might come from this. There are cities that are trying to create new structures for their citizens to have public services, tourism, museums in VR that we can agree or not that they are part of the metaverse. Sorry if they come too loud. But the thing is, it comes from not having a central definition about what the metaverse is. And these internal tensions between if it's going to be centralized, it's going to be decentralized, it's going to be in the middle. What are the revenue models that we are going to sustain? Because the difference in who is going to pay the bill for the metaverse is going to have a huge impact in all of the questions about ethics that we are talking about. And going back to the 90s is like thinking about the internet and how the internet was a lot of things at the moment, but how is today, it's a very, very different thing and more comprehensive. So it's a problem of definitions. As Kim was saying, it's a really difficult task, how to define the metaverse. So I like to say that for me, it's a work in progress definition that is a convergence of different technologies, convergence of different phenomena, because we have metaverses coming from gaming, a lot of them were coming from social media spaces, and at the same time, it's a convergence of reality, because we are seeing things that are kind of going across what I call the reality gradient. And also it's a convergence of infrastructure, digital infrastructure and physical infrastructure. When I talk about the reality gradient, is that there is no rigid separation between reality, or what people call reality, and digital experiences. So we are going in transitioning in these spaces, like sometimes it's replacing our sounds, sometimes it's going to add some layer of visuals into it. And we're gradually going into a full immersive experience. The thing is that it requires infrastructure, physical infrastructure, the exchanges, the cables, data centers. It also requires infrastructure to access. So we need to think about hardware, and we need to think about, and there was an excellent session on More Than Just a Game about the patents for the metaverse. So for me, my work in progress definition is that the metaverse is a high dimensional cultural artifact. If you come from mathematics or think about that, this kind of definition of a high dimensional artifact is when you have like multiple layers that you cannot condense into one single object. So the thing is, in the metaverse, we are seeing this conversion of different aspects that are mixing technology, anthropology, sociology, and of course, we need to talk about the human experience that we're going to have in the metaverse. So responsibly designing the metaverse is going to take a lot of work and a lot of questions, particularly not to repeat the history that we already have seen into the internet. So a lot of the lessons that we must learn from internet governance is like, we have a rich history talking about zero rating and who is going to provide these services, how we are going to ensure net neutrality, and the same questions that we have in the internet. And something that was also Kim saying, or if I interpreted that correctly, for me as well, is that the metaverse is not something that might be essentially different, but it's going to be a difference of magnitudes. It's going to be more intense, it's going to be more embodied, but there are some of the things that are already present in our current internet. So that is what we need to think about. And for me, the key ingredient for the metaverse success is connection. And that connection has different layers and different nuances, because we can think about a connection of systems. So we can think about economic interoperability and how the content is going to flow from one place to another, it's going to move from one place to another. We can think about technical interoperability, how we're going to establish the standards, protocols, and the software to make one piece of and digital object be rendered and function in the same way in other metaversal space. And also we need to talk about legal interoperability, because our current regulations do not allow, or at least do not have a clear understanding of how we're going to make content go from one place to the other. But at the same time, and I totally agree, and that was what I was thinking, that saying that I want to work with you, we should work together, is that it's a thing about social connection, communities, because the metaverse is going to be also the communities that are going to be there, and how these communities are formed, because a metaverse with no one is just a simple virtual world. So we can think about the metaverse as architecture, we can think about not repeating the same problems that we have that have led to create these very fragmented spaces on the internet and walled gardens. And for me, everyone's talking about that the metaverse is going to be free, but you're going to be as free as you can afford to pay, because it's going to depend on the viability models. So are we going to have a creative freedom sandbox, or are we going to have paywall access? And this is from my techie background, and also I'm going to add something that Ryan Black brilliantly added to my slide. This is the metaverse utopia is the Star Trek holodeck, but lawyers can see this utopia being transformed by the increasing amounts of terms of service and pieces of regulations that are going to interfere with your experience in the metaverse. So the metaverse is a convergence of technologies, but it's also a convergence of regulation and frameworks. And that leads us to a lot of the unsolved problems and risk for the metaverse. And I don't want to overstand because I'm going to just pass really quickly about this. But for me, another of the problems that we are going to have to deal is that we're going to need content, and the content at this moment could be easily provided by generative AI. So we need to bring into the table the problems that generative AI is bringing on the ethical grounds. The problems that we already knew about AI in terms of opacity, bias, scalability, but also the problems of labor and appropriation of human culture, and the opportunities and risk that this technology is creating. So in the future, and this, I will leave it with this open for the discussion, but my biggest concern is when we are talking about this embodiment and we are talking about this future of interfaces, what is the role of neurotechnology? Because there are a lot of companies, not only social media companies, but also video games companies trying to work in this new future of the interfaces, incorporating brain-computer interfaces as a way to access these experiences, both in gaming and eventually in metaverse spaces. And for me, this could be a fantastic technology, but we know that this is going to extract a huge amount of data that we cannot control. We might be able to consent, but we might not be able to control. And so at this point, for me, the metaverse is like the new distraction that is kind of like trying to move our attention from the current internet governance problems. So there is a lot to talk about ethics and a lot of the problems that we haven't solved yet, particularly on AI and the very intrinsic relation with AI and the metaverse. And for those Spanish speakers, I have this paper that could be interesting for you to read, so I will share it here and end my presentation with that. Sorry if I went over time. I was trying to.
No, don't worry, Micaela. I forgot to check timing. So you were really engaging. I wasn't looking at the clock. It is my fault not to wave at you. But thank you so much. I mean, I underline a couple of sentences you use, and probably we're going to go back to that after John's introduction. But I'm noticing that one of the underlying points is that this offline online debate, and we always suffer when we make it, because I mean for a lot of us the internet's always been real. It's never been something totally separated, but there's been an increased understanding that this has consequences, and that's probably one of the good outcome of the explosion of the interest in the metaverse. And I was actually hoping you to use one of your catchphrases. We ruined the internet. What should we do not to ruin the metaverse? But you didn't use it, so I'm stealing it. John, thank you very much. We're running a little bit late, but you don't mind, right?
I certainly don't mind. My name is Jon FESTINGER. I am a media lawyer for my whole career. Importantly for this presentation, originally a newsroom lawyer, a freedom of expression lawyer. That's been the essence of my career. I have been teaching at the Allard School of Law, which is part of the University of British Columbia, since 1993. We can go to the next slide. My starting point is that when we're looking at times of tumultuous change, which we are, things are not always what they seem. Some of you will remember in 1993 the notion that that copyright was dead. And those of us who are intellectual property lawyers know that the opposite is true. Next slide. My definition of the metaverse is a very simple one and probably informed by my legal background. So my definition is pretty simple, and that is life through a digital lens. And I really respect Kim's very clear and helpful definition. But I think being an old video gamer, and I think where we all agree is that the metaverse is not other. We live in real life, and our interfaces in digital spaces happen in the real world. Next slide, please. That isn't to say that technology doesn't affect very profoundly the technology, sort of the matrix that we're looking at. Technology does define how we look at life, and that's an essential issue with the metaverse. Next slide. So I want to look at a single issue, really, and that is in this very strange time of great polarization, what are we to make of free speech and free expression? Because it's a concept that's being used by a great many people in a lot of different ways, and often in oppressive ways. And understanding free speech and free expression, which has been kind of a basic rule of law concept, I think is becoming increasingly important in the world, and therefore important in the metaverse. Next slide. And we please, next slide again. This is the challenge is going to be not controlling my own slides and going quite as quick as I otherwise would. So many issues that of the metaverse can be understood as free speech issues. I think that's the core. And when we're thinking about these issues, I'm just going to ask you to think about children as well. Next slide. When I was a young lawyer, it was very clear to me what free expression was and what a free press was. It was fighting the government, who was trying to suppress information and suppress free speech. And in the American idiom, I'm Canadian, but in the North American idiom, the New York Times publishing the Pentagon Papers, and the Washington Post, despite huge US government opposition, breaking the Watergate story, that was free expression. And the problem with free expression was government. It wasn't each other, and it certainly wasn't the internet as it was then in its infant stages. Go next slide. So we can say, well, everyone has free speech. Everyone is a creator. Is that really true? Next slide. We sign away our free speech rights contractually. And this is all the more true in the metaverse. Next slide. We have contracts as users, as consumers. We don't have rights. It's the platforms who have free speech rights against the government. So if a government wants to pass consumer protection legislation, for example, it can often, in various jurisdictions, and has been questioned on free speech, free expression grounds. Next slide. So, in a weird way, in this new metaversian world, this used to be one of my favorite old sayings when I was a young media lawyer. Freedom of the press is guaranteed only to those who own one. Well, we think we all own a printing press now, but we don't. In fact, it's the platforms who do, and that raises a key concern. Next slide. All of this becomes more complicated, as Micaela certainly has enumerated, with the coming of artificial intelligence. Next slide. Which is causing a revolution in our abilities and in our thinking on the subject, and raising some fairly scary possibilities. Next slide. Even though it has great abilities. Please go on. Next slide. And the core of the problem is that we are giving an incredible amount of information about ourselves. As Kim has pointed out, we are becoming consumed by our own information. Next slide. I just love this. This is a cow that produces more milk because it's in VR and it has a calming effect. Now that you can laugh at that, you can also reflect on how incredibly manipulative that is. Next slide. And we are constantly seeing these stories about how our minds are going to be read, and it's all quite scientific, and it's not voodoo science. It's really that we've just given up so much information about ourselves. Next slide. So we've seen scandals before, and it does seem that in the metaverse we may see more manipulation and even darker patterns, darker scandals. Next slide. Many of you, not all of you, but I certainly do, will have a computer chess game app on your phone. Next slide. Just think about what AI is capable of. In 1997, IBM's Big Blue computer could beat Boris Spassky, the former world chess champion, at chess. And if you have one of those chess apps on your phone, you know you can't beat it. It will beat you every time if you set it to beat you. Next slide. Next slide. So we know in law how to deal with children. We protect them. But in this world of AI and the metaverse, are we all children? Because the capabilities of AI are potentially so great. Next slide. Law, I think this shouldn't be very controversial. Law should intervene when we've lost our human agency. If somebody is in control of us and we're not in control of ourselves, it's not unfair to say that's where legal intervention should occur. Next slide. And we talk a lot about freedom of speech, and certainly the platforms talk about freedom of speech because they're the ones who would mostly be entitled to it. But there is another right that we don't talk about very much. There is some recent academic work that's really terrific, and that right is freedom of thought. It's in our Charter of Rights in Canada. Next slide. It's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But it's not a very animated right in the sense that academics haven't written a lot about it. And again, the recent work that's been done, there've been some really good pieces over the last few years, but those pieces really concentrate on government. We're back to the early days of free speech, and that is saying that our rights are being curtailed by government. So these pieces talk about what happens if our rights are being curtailed by government. But that's not the issue in the metaverse. The issue in the metaverse is that intermediate layer of corporations. Next slide. This just happens to be my definition of freedom of thought. We don't have to dwell on it now. Next slide. Here's the point that I do want to dwell on. Consider whether in the metaverse, freedom of thought is more important than freedom of expression. And it probably is, given all of these fears. Now, there's one very interesting feature about freedom of thought from a legal perspective, and that is that it's extraordinarily hard to argue that freedom of thought is something that a corporate entity can have. It is intrinsically human. Freedom of expression, you can argue that corporations have freedom of expression, corporations are people. Our tests in corporate law have allowed, and the results have allowed for free expression to be attached to corporations. But the tests generally say that you have to apply these principles in a common sense way. And thought is essentially human, and it would be very hard to attach freedom of thought to a corporation. So for that reason, in strict legal terms, we humans are entitled, we people are entitled to freedom of thought. Corporations are not. And that, next slide, gives governments the potential ability to regulate the metaverse in favor of humans without being challenged legally, because it doesn't seem, if they use freedom of thought and protecting freedom of thought as their rationale, it becomes very hard for the platforms to challenge that notion. Much, much harder than already established defenses that the platforms have based on freedom of expression. That's the core of the argument I want to make, that freedom of thought is the most important human right that we can animate in the new digital world, or the old digital world of the metaverse. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jon. I was totally focused in my multitasking, listening, taking notes, and taking ages to switch the slides. Sorry. Amazing presentation.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. And my apologies again that I never figured out how to share my slides.
No, don't worry, don't worry. We work it out. Now, I have a number of questions because there are a few points that I would like to discuss, but I'm trying not to repeat what already been presented in the presentation. And I invite all the attendees, if they want, to just type in their question in the chat, and I'm going to read it up. And I want to run it as a conversation, because I have an understanding that I don't know if it's the correct one. And I felt that during the years of the hype, I kind of tricked myself in using the metaverse as an excuse to discuss issues that we already have. because it made me a little bit more relaxed in running the conversation, because it's something you can postpone in the future. Like it is our ethical question that we have to answer in the future because the technology is not there. And the more I've been working on it, the more I realize the vast majority are problems that we already have, and things that are going to only be accrued by technology and by a less immediate divide between what you see in a two-dimensional screen and what you see in the physical world. So even discussion that we didn't have on persistence, on immersiveness, and now this impact on us are coming because 2D becomes 3D, and 3D becomes even more enriched by all the other senses. And I have a number of questions I would like to discuss with you, because I mean, some of these are problems we have already, but they become increasingly more difficult to deal with in the metaverse. And it is difficult also to understand what kind of metaverse we want to build, because at the moment there is not a clear idea of what it is. One, many, interconnected. Not there is so much excitement and a lot of other technology that are going to enrich the metaverse, and we don't even consider them part of the metaverse yet, because they're not being fully integrated. But there are some fundamental questions that I have, because one of the things that I keep listening outside of this seminar is this idea that we have to, in the convergence of physical and digital, we kind of have to repeat everything that we have in the physical in the digital. That I start questioning whether or not it is a good idea to actually transfer everything, because we should aim higher to make something better. But at that point, my follow-up question is, who is going to decide if it's better or worse? I mean, we're discussing a lot about of ethics, but I have this fundamental question: whose ethics? And then the final one, and then I'll just gonna let you talk on these 3 points. How are we gonna measure success? Because I know it's something that Kim has been drilling me with toxicity. How do you measure success when you fight against toxicity? But it's a fundamental question, because I mean, we want to build a metaverse that is better for everyone, but how do we determine where we're actually doing it, or we're pushing in the right direction when there are so many questions lying in the background? It was supposed to be a question. There are 3 questions, sorry. But if you let me speak more, I'm going to drop even more questions. So I'll stop for a moment.
I can chime in with a provocation about that, because one of the things, and I have talked with Kate Edwards about this as well, is about the geography of the metaverse, because we are, and this kind of resonates what you were saying about replication and why are we replicating or trying, I like to say, trying to port the tangible world into the metaverse and recreate these logics of scarcity is something that was particularly for me was like a very perplexing question at the very hype of like selling real estate in the metaverse, and you were seeing this notion of distance when we are talking about a digital world that inherently doesn't have distance. For those who are old enough to remember the Matrix movie, that quote about "is air what you're breathing?" for me resonates a lot with that. Is why are we trying to put the laws of physics, the laws of distance, the laws of scarcity particularly, and this is relevant both for talking about copyright and talking about the intersection of abundance technologies, because we're talking about, and Kim also pointed out as well, when we're talking about generative AI, we can create huge amounts of content for good and bad, and with all the problems that this creates. But at the same time, and also this touches with the point of Sean about copyright being dead. I don't think it's dead, but I think it needs to look at itself at the mirror and start to make some questions about its identity. Because we are seeing that these new technologies point a challenge to these assumptions. And for me, one of the things of creating something different and better for the metaverse is like, we just not have to apply the same frameworks, the same laws, the same physics without questioning the new medium.
I'll take a shot at both questions. I think the first question is, which is, who is going to decide, is significantly easier because we have a current model, and the legal reality is that the platforms are deciding on the ethics by dint of having end user license agreements. They are the governing bodies of our day-to-day lives in the metaverse and on the internet, subject only to the role of government itself, which sometimes intervenes, sometimes doesn't, and that is a complicated, especially in a rule of law state, a complicated issue. In terms of what is the measurement of success? Well, there's a simple common sense test, and that is the world a better place? Because that's what we want. How we measure that in terms of communities formed, in terms of our individuality and differences being honored and amplified, and our understanding of each other becoming greater. It would be fabulous to develop some metrics around that so that we could actually test them, and to create some goals around that platforms and others would embrace, so that we could head in the right direction. Kim?
Yeah, gosh, so many good thoughts, so many good questions. I mean, I guess just to start with, yeah, absolutely. I don't think we should. I think it would be folly to try to one-to-one recreate what we have in the physical, not only because it's not great in a lot of ways and there's room for improvement, and as you said earlier, we should strive for greater, but also there are so many ways in which these digital spaces are different. What's the same is humans. It's humans under different conditions, but the human equation in this is still, I think, very salient. And a lot of the problems that we are having in digital spaces come out of this, right? They're very human problems. Human relationships are fraught. We haven't evolved to interface in the ways that we are able to interface in online spaces at the scales that we're interfacing, crossing cultural boundaries that we are. And that's not to say those aren't wonderful aspects of what the internet and technology brings us, but it's still hard. Tolerance isn't something we necessarily get for free. Tolerance is something that is taught, it is passed down, it is a cultural thing that we need to intentionally imbue, because as humans, we are very reticent to engage with those that we don't know or those that we don't understand. And online, that information, especially today, is not served up in a very salient way. What I mean by that is you might just be a little avatar. You might just be a name. All of the things that make me Kimberly VOLL, for example, are, outside of, yes, you can harvest information about me and, go wild and Google me, but that my humanness and what is conveyed when we are actually in a physically co-located, that's absent. And those communication channels are so vital. What is it? I think it's it's at the tip of my brain. I think it's the contact theory. This idea that the closer we are to each other in terms of being able to interact and get to know one another, the less likely we are to see hate. And that the further you go away from the walls and the problems and everything else, the greater manifestation of hate you have. So being able to close that gap, I think, is a really key piece of what we need to look at when we're looking at these spaces. But so much of it is designed around bigger and broader and get more people in there and just scale, scale, scale. So I think that's a really important consideration. I'm on the ethical question, like who decides it better? Gosh, I love this question. There's so much, there's such a tendency in all of us, right? Because our realities are our realities. We superimpose them and use those as the frameworks through which we interpret others' thoughts and feelings and behaviors. And so, of course, I'm going to be biased toward applying my reality to you doesn't mean it's better or, more right or whatnot. And so, we see that all over the place with like lingering colonialism and all sorts of issues in that regard. So I think we first need to decide, like Jon was pointing out, how do we measure success? Well, what are the metrics? What does it mean to thrive? What does it mean to have equitable access to things? What does good look like? I think if we can find measures to assess how well we are relating to one another, do people feel fulfilled? Do they have the right amount of connection? What is the richness of our lives? Do we have equitable access to opportunities? What are the instances of problems that we're seeing? Can we define and articulate those? At least, this is always a simplification. Anytime you measure something, it's a simplification of something. But I think we are so far from understanding that and being able to even say, this is what we're striving toward. This is what we're going for. Right now, we're very much stuck in, which is important to think about, but we're very much stuck in, here's all of the bad things. And when we do that, we can't aim high because we're always putting out the fires in front of us. And those are important fires. We're going to burn if we don't deal with them. But we very much need, I think, to be able to step back and take the time and space to be able to think, where are we going? As Micaela called out in her talk, the purpose. What is it that we are trying to do? What does good start to look like? And answer those questions. So it's a non-answer because I don't think we have the answer, but I guess it's just a doubling down of, I think it's the right question.
No, but Kim, I think we're still in the phase in which we have to polish the questions. That is the phase we should be in, because I mean, we can only imagine where we don't want to go, but still how to set up a framework, even a mental framework, to identify the right things to focus, like the line that we don't want to cross. Because these are really difficult to draw, because even, Micaela was mentioning, you were also mentioning at the beginning, who is paying for that? Because of course, who is paying for creating and maintaining the metaverse is the person that is designing the business model. And we know that some business models are not really good for us in general because they come with consequence. Honestly, free comes with a lot of consequence. Sometimes it's cheaper to pay instead of getting something for free. And then we have this idea of creating an environment that is persistence, and more than the persistency things. And I think it's something that also Jon wrote a few years ago. The issue of having this environment that is the same for everyone is really important, because we base our opinion and our democracy is based, okay, probably not anymore, but our democracy used to be based on the fact that we all agree on facts. We can have different opinion, but the facts are facts. It's not probably a reality anymore, but in the metaverse, it's much more a crux. And this gets connected to a fact that still shocked me. I mean, not even Google Map looks the same depending when you're logging in. If you're logging from different jurisdiction, you see something different on Google Map. And this translated to the metaverse and this omnipresence environment is pretty scary if we log in and we see two different things. If our realities are different because of, in a good way, could be because of IP, because of a license that's not been rightfully written, but could be for another series of bad reasoning that is going to influence our decision. And that's why I keep asking where the ethics, whose ethics, and whose ethics for. Yes, Jon.
So just to add kind of one, I think, threshold piece of this that's really important as we get to the ethics part itself, and that is transparency of information to all of us who are in the metaverse. How much information do we have from the platforms about the core issue of what data is being collected about us and how it's being used? And it seems to me that is almost a baseline issue as things get more and more complex technologically. A baseline issue is knowing what information is being collected and how it's going to be used. And also, warnings, for example, about, various possibilities that should be disclosed to us, that our data is going to be used for X and Y, or we're embarking on a path that may be addictive or problematic. There's a whole layer of information that can be disclosed to users that I think is probably the first of the ethical problems that we have to solve, and that the platforms either solve or government should solve for them. So I'll leave it at that.
But Jon, can I just repeat for 1 second? Because yes, you're right. That would be amazing. But there is a problem that we already have. We are overflow with information, and sharing this kind of information with the user might be really helpful if we're all adults. But we're not adults. Even I'm not adult anymore. I don't read the end user license agreements. If they send me an update for a data leak that I was part of, I changed my password, but I'm never gonna go and check whether that has been. We're being so normalized in having our not reading what we're supposed to read.
Well, there has to be an educational responsibility, and look, we can't force people. People will do things that aren't good for them. People will smoke. People will do other things like that. But the information needs to be available. It needs to be clear, and it needs to be an ethical obligation. And it needs to be, in essence, a ground zero ethical obligation, and on which other things can be built. We can't force users to read things, but we can make sure it's there, and we can make sure it's clear, and that's not there. And I'll give you an example. It's a video game example, but when we talk about ratings boards, for example, we rate all sorts of things. So we give parents and gamers all sorts of information. But you know what I realized the other day? We don't have any rating dealing with addiction, for example. How addictive is this game? How manipulative is this game in terms of getting you to, yes, we're saying that you may have to buy virtual items, but that's not the same as disclosing that there are deeper patterns or dark patterns involved. And not everybody knows what a loot box is. So it's kind of that level of information and transparency that we need to start getting at as a matter of ethics and law. That's sort of my submission.
I think there's just building off of that, if I'm understanding correctly, Jon, I think part of it is an obligation for sense making. Like somewhere that burden needs to sit to be able to take that information and translate that into something that we can reasonably assume that the end user could consume. And I think that oftentimes, it's like, having that huge TOS, that huge terms of, no one's going to read that. No one reads. I mean, if someone does, no shame, I am impressed. But most of us, and it's not like as a game maker, I'm going, well, they should have read it. I know they're not reading it either. So we're not going to go sit down next to everyone and feed them this and do a quiz and make sure. Like, that's an extreme. That doesn't make any sense. But we're way too far to one side. And I think that's where, not to make this all about design, it's just where my brain goes, but that's where I think design and opportunities there, because we can bring in those human factors to think about, well, how do humans typically work? How are they going to interface in these spaces? Are there ways that we can surface that information in a more ethical and responsible way that increases the likelihood they will get what they need out of that, and then can use that to make more informed decisions? We can't go the whole way, but I think we can bring them closer to that.
Or create warnings. Are you sure you want to go here? Are you sure you want to smoke this cigarette? We do that all the time. And we treat adults like children. And my argument is that we are all children moving forward, and we do need these warnings. And then we should have free choice. I'm not diminishing the role of free choice.
I can chime in with something. I was thinking about the labels, informational labels that we have, for example, in nutrition, in food, that we have a lot of the information that we need, making it succinct in an accessible way. And also coming from IP law, its trademarks are a shorthand to condense a lot of the information that we know about the brand, because we trust this brand, we know the products that we have had before from this brand. And I agree with Kim that the thing is like everything is so far out on one end because we are dealing with digital content in terms of licenses, not as consumers. Because if you go back to the consumer framework and if you have stronger consumer protection laws, you can enforce these rights to have information in an accessible manner. So you should have like labels like this game is this and that, the same as the boards. And I was thinking in terms of designs, for example, something really interesting that is happening with some cultural products, like the trigger warnings, like how people started to realize that if you need to access these contents, you need to be aware that the things that are going to expect, not spoiling the content, but you might find something referring to suicide, harms, these emotional triggers. And for me, it's interesting how this is going to operate because we are thinking about terms of service like in this 2D version of how we access content on the internet, but how this is going to look in a 3D immersive environment. And I agree with the warnings, but the fact is that we don't care about the warnings as well. As you were saying, the horrible photograph in the smoking, in the cigarettes packagings, but also some apps like Instagram have a warning. You can set the time limit of how much do you want to spend in that app. But even if you are in control of this, for me, there is also a more pervasive thing is that we talk a lot about how we enter this immersive experience, but we are not talking about the everlasting impact in our cognitive functions, because we don't have protocols to safely come back from this experience. We still don't know how to disengage. And I wrote something that I can share about how divers go back from the experience of diving to the surface and they have to decompress, or how, for example, in a more emotional context, how practicants of BDSM, after the session ends, they have like this practice of care to go back from one state to the other. And we don't still have this language for XR and immersion. And my concern, and going back, I don't know, I think it was you, Jon, that mentioned about people creating this disinformation text, and I think also Kim mentioned that, but how this is going to impact with the people that already is believing conspiracy theories. I think, I'm confusing, but I think it was Gaetano that said, but we are seeing this race of totalitarianism and people ready to believe things that are not true, and you were talking about this, accessing different contexts on the same web page, and we are now seeing a further step, which is accessing the system through AI providing content in our lateral language that could be modified and customized like a contextual internet. And that for me is super problematic because it's going to create techno-solipsism, where you can find like the libertarian metaverse that is going to confirm all your beliefs. So it's a lot of questions.
Sorry, can I just attach to where you're going? A question that we had on the chat that I would like to rephrase a bit, because it is true there is a lot of discussion on decentralization being crucial to the metaverse. But the first question would be, is that true? Do we need the decentralization for the metaverse? Or can we have a totally single platform of control like the Oasis in the future? And would that be better for an ethical development of the metaverse, because you have only one corporation to take into consideration? And the follow-up question would be, if decentralization and we're envisaging multiple metaverse, is there any way we can make them more commercially viable when they're ethical? Of course, whatever ethicals might mean in our discussion. Is there a way? Because I noticed Kimberly immediately wrote human first design. Is it possible? Is this economically valuable? Can we hope for that? Because consumers decide and they want something that makes them feel insert a word there.
I'll be quick. I don't think it's realistic that we are going to have one giant metaverse. I think the problems of interoperability and different companies vying for control are going to continue. We're going to have the same issues we have on the internet. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because I think if there was one company in charge, I think that's more dangerous to freedom of thought. And I'd rather have diversity and plurality with the challenges. In terms of the second issue, Gaetano, which is, will we ever want to eat our Brussels sprouts? Will we want to do things just because they're good for us? I would point to what's happening with Twitter. I would point out that we're seeing very profound changes, and we're seeing financial failure because a lot of people are saying, you know what, Twitter is not good, and it's really become worse. And there's a lot of us looking. I quit Twitter as soon as Elon made his first offer because I kind of knew what was coming. So yes, I'm looking for the Twitter replacement that is just starting, and I'm anxious to try it. So I do think I do think that users have ethics and can make change and will make change.
Yeah, I would add physical spaces are not decentralized. We don't tend to think about them that way, but in many respects, they're not. Yes, I can get on a plane and I can fly over and come visit you, Gaetano, but there's a lot of barriers to that. There's a lot of things that make that not just a thing that I do. I don't have that access to. We're seeing some of those walls fall in terms of the like online markets and my ability to nonetheless buy something from overseas and have it delivered to me within probably 48 hours. So there's those sorts of breakdowns. But I think the decentralization question is fascinating to me. I think there's aspects of it we will want. Certainly we will want some flavor of cross communication between these environments. We have that today. My credit card works wherever I go, basically, in the world, that sort of thing. Not to oversimplify, it's not that easy, but generally speaking, we have a lot of that. But there's many other ways that we don't. And given that as humans, we don't work very well at scale, I think that the looking at how we organize and bringing some intentionality in how we can facilitate those experiences with care, because we can very easily cross the line into too much control and that being unhealthy. But I think that is an opportunity for us. You were talking earlier about how we control these realities within these spaces, and whether that's through what information you have access to or whatnot. But the takeaway here is that reality is malleable and tailored. We don't always get a choice in that, what is served to us, but sometimes we do too. And that's also scary, because allowing us to tailor everything means we don't have to do the work. And I think this is where this all starts to come in, is if we are fractured, the danger is we're not exposed to different cultures or ideologies or ideas. That's the thing that we need in order to be able to germinate tolerance and to be able to develop healthy societies. I think that is a key piece of this conversation around decentralization.
Oh, thank you, Kim. Micaela, you get the last word, because I was checking at the time. We have just a few minutes left.
I'm going to be super quick. I tend to think like in visual metaphors and allegories. And for me, decentralization could be, think about the metaverse as a bunch of grapes, where you have like every metaverse is a grape, but you have like the connecting infrastructure that is the stem. And the thing is, for me, it will need to be in the middle, because fully decentralization is what we have seen in crypto. And when things go wrong, there is no safe net. On the other hand, we are seeing the dangers of centralization for our democracy in our current internet discourse. So it's going to need to be like some balance. So maybe we can see on more centralized ecosystems like the grape, and a really nature of public infrastructure on the stem, that we have like the same rules. So when we leave that moment, we have like the same level playground. But it's really tough because we don't have an homogeneous regulation around the world. So the most coherent and cohesive framework that we have is human rights. And when you were saying how we define ethics, we cannot, because we go back to philosophy and the definition of ethics and moral philosophy, and the choices between wrong and right is contextual and cultural. The thing is, at least we can agree on human rights. So maybe we can think about this public infrastructure for the STEM and imbue it with human-centric values and human-centric framework, and maybe more control into the virtual worlds / grapes. But at the same time is tricky because we have seen some debates around this in the internet, for example, exchanging more control over your information for security reasons. So we have biometric cameras on the cities because it's going to be safer, and it's a tricky balance to achieve.
Gaetano, can I just add something that on something Kim said in terms of kind of the real world? You know, when you order something on the internet, for example, the whole, you know, if you order something and you can see this in forums, people comparing how much taxes they have to pay and customs duties in various countries. And Micaela, in your country, it's crazy the amount of customs duties that have to be paid. You basically double the price of anything you order. Well, one really constructive thing could be to create a free trade zone in the metaverse for things that you order that apply to the metaverse. I'm not saying, you know, for cereal, but for your computer parts, for, you know, there are things that we could do that would palpably make the world a better place and a more equal place, and a place where we can communicate with less differences. And I know the free trade idea is kind of, you know, out there, but it would improve a lot of people's quality of life. And free trade is a legitimate economic concept. And if we could find ways of introducing it on the metaverse would become a better, more accessible, and more successful place.
Thank you very much, Jon. We run out of time. I have still a page and a half of questions, but since Aurelio turned the camera on, that means that we're really run out of time. And so I'm just gonna thank you, Kim. Thank you, Micaela, and thank you, Jon. It's been a fantastic introduction to the ethical question regarding responsible development of the metaverse. Aurelio, I'll give you back the microphone.
Well, what can I say after your words? Well, first of all, thanks a lot, Micaela, Kim, Jon, Gaetano, for your excellent sharing, and also for helping in choosing the participant on this round table. Thank you, Raul, for helping us on the organization of the webinar. This is just the start. We were a few, but you know, we have just started with this new project. I invite you all to finish to our next webinar that will take place on Monday, 5th of June at 4:30 Central European Time. Myself and Teresa Rodriguez de las Heras will be presenting a paper on the European Digital Acts and the Metaverse, fit for purpose. That is the topic that we would like to discuss, and that hopefully will have as an outcome a paper that would be published in the future. Thanks a lot. Have a nice day, have a nice evening, and see you around in new events, my dears. Bye-bye. Ciao, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Gracias. Bye-bye.
Ciao.